The Squad has been writing some revisionist history about the handling of the railroad strike at the end of last year, of course. And they've been spinning the narrative to make it sound like they're voting for both the strike-breaking bill itself, which Joe Biden requested, and the amendment to provide the 7 paid sick days to the railroad workers was done at the request of the Railroad Workers Union. Yesterday, however, Jacobin Magazine, which is a very, very squad-friendly outlet, I'm kind of surprised that they ran this since they have been very invested in the squad. They published a piece, not really an article so much as a sort of press release, by Railroad Workers United organizer Ron Kaminkow. And he writes in this piece, I'm going to read this a bit. The headline is, Railroad Workers United, we would never concede our right to strike. All right. So let's just read through this a little bit, not the whole thing, but this is very short. On April 11th, 2023, Jacobin published a transcript of an interview by editor-at-large David Sirota with Representative AOC. We're going to play a little bit of that interview in a few minutes. In the context of a general...
This was before he interviewed Marianne. I heard he was seen with a broken leg after that one.
A little piece of screen protector lodged in his eye socket. In the context of a general discussion about differences between the, quote, progressive wing of the Democratic Party and the Biden administration, the subject of the vote to break the strike of the railroad workers came up. In defending her votes, one to approve 7 days of sick leave for rail workers and one to support the president's bill to block the strike, Ocasio-Cortez states that she was acting on the wishes of RWU and other groups of railroad workers. She states in the interview, when you look after the vote, folks like RWU were saying this is what we asked them to do. Later, she says, because, for example, with the rail vote, the only partners that I had leading up to that were rail workers. And if that's what they asked us to do, then that's what we did. But here it is, straight from the source. Like I said, this is an RWU guy. But Ocasio-Cortez is clouding the reality of the situation by referring to the vote when, in fact, there were two separate and distinctive votes. One bill proposed 7 days of paid sick time, while the other bill blocked rail workers from striking. These bills were completely independent of one another. Railroad Workers United cannot speak with any certainty as to what the official position of the various craft unions' respective leaderships was on the question of blocking the strike, but RWU made crystal clear by our words and actions throughout contract negotiations that while we were, of course, in full support of 7 days of sick leave for rail workers, RWU would never be in favor of any legislation denying railroad workers our human right to withhold our labor when all else fails in our struggle for safe working conditions and dignity, regardless of whatever concessions may be dangled. I hope Ryan Grimm gets a chance to read this over, actually. RWU was and is in favor of any legislation that would grant any relief to the barbaric working conditions we contend with, but we would never concede our right to strike. We thank Ocasio-Cortez and other members of the House and Senate for their votes in support of sick leave, but we are not happy at all with her or others in both chambers who voted to deny railroad workers the right to strike. There you have it. A pretty direct, no bullshit rebuke of her theory of this. Now, of course, the idea that railroad workers agreed to have their right to strike taken away was also absurd, that she's been talking about. But beyond the substance of the bill, you have AOC also spinning a false narrative about whose idea it was to pass this amendment. And we'll get into that in a bit. But before we do that, let's play a bit of that Sirota interview, shall we? Where she spins this. Now, I have to apologize in advance because there's quite a bit of word salad here leading up to what she attempts as a main point. Of course, word salad is what politicians cook up when they have no main point.
The rail vote, for example, we worked very closely with all elements of the rail workers. Of rail workers, both not just the Teamsters, not just some of the other formal unions, but also those members of the unions that were rebelling against the initial round of these agreements. And it was in tandem with these organizations. Like when you look at, for example, RWU, and some of those folks that were leading the fight on opposing that initial agreement to a terrible contract, those were the folks that we were working with in developing our organizing strategy around this. And it was in following, the actual rail workers lead, both on both camps. This was not just about choosing traditional union leadership, but also that rank and file grassroots leadership that we try.
First of all, I just have to pause it for a second.
I don't even know what the fuck she's talking about.
Well, there's a lot of word salad, like I said, to sit through. There's a lot of that. And there was no real way to cut in. That's the point of word salad, is to make you sit through.
Exactly.
Like, there was no way to cut in halfway into it with any context, right? But this whole idea, the very premise that there were those who wanted the contract as is and those who didn't, and we had to weigh those two options, even that's nonsense. For one, what Kshama said, you're a socialist, you don't vote to break up a strike, period. Number two, all of the unions, even the unions that were willing to take the bad deal, they were willing to also, in solidarity with the unions who didn't want the deal, they were willing to strike alongside them. They would join them in a strike.
Right.
So even the ones who were okay with taking the shitty deal were like, okay, well, if you're not, we're going to side with you. We will join that picket line.
Yeah, when they had the protest outside of Grand Central after Biden stabbed them in the back, the airline pilots were there in solidarity.
Right, exactly.
Like if the railroad workers had struck, that could have run through a lot of other adjacent unions with equally pissed off, overworked, and abused labor. It could have set off a chain reaction if they had struck. It's sad because I remember from very early on, there were memes spreading around. I remember one in particular that showed her morphing into Nancy Pelosi over time.
Right.
And it was like, that's not fair. That's not fair. And yeah, it was totally fair. Sorry if I criticized anyone who's spreading that. I don't think I did. I'm too cynical to go after somebody for that, but I felt it was unfair at the time, which it probably was. But I have to concede they saw something I didn't at that time.
Right. Indeed. All right, let's let her finish. She finally gets to, like I said, some attempt at substance here.
Tried to determine our strategy. That we worked with Senator Sanders and we worked with many others, saying, how do you all want us to proceed? And the initial push was to rubber stamp this agreement with no attempt at getting paid leave. And procedurally, what we were asked to do by that rank and file is to get us a paid leave vote. That was the determination.
Yeah, they just wanted
was
a
the
vote.
Organizing leading up to
That was
that
all
vote.
they wanted.
Okay, it's very,
A
very
vote.
likely.
They didn't actually want the leave. They wanted the vote. That's
They
what
wanted
people
the
don't
vote.
understand. These guys are crazy for votes.
Right.
They love votes. And actually, I mean, that's something they've talked about, adding a letter to the LGBTQIA for people who have a fetish for votes. A V.
Right. The LGBTQIA
vote
V
fetish.
plus community.
Yeah, because a lot of them are railroad workers.
What she's saying there is that they wanted a vote on paid leave. That's what she just said there. Let's let her go because we are about to deal with this in a second clip that we have. But here we go.
That was the request that was made of me, and that is what I agreed to deliver on. Now, I think on the other end of that, there is a difference between this kind of like spontaneous digital response versus the actual organizing rooms and people that are directly impacted by this. And when you look after the vote, folks like RWU were saying this is what we asked them to do.
No, that's not what they were asking for. The RWU guy just wrote an article saying, no, that wasn't the ask. But her claim that we were doing what was asked of us by the union workers, this never made sense. This never smelled right. And as this vote was going down, as this whole deal was going down, Russell and I actually interviewed the day that the strike was effectively broken up. Russell and I interviewed Devin Nance from the Brotherhood of Maintenance of Way Employees Division about how these talks between union workers and squad members went down. So you just heard AOC's version, which is, hey, the union workers came to us and said, we want to vote on sick leave, and we delivered for them, right? That's her spin. Here's how this went down. We're going to play an interview from when Russ and I were younger and more handsome than we are now, back in December of 2022. This was the
even more handsome, if you can imagine.
Even more handsome, if you can believe it. This is the day the strike was broken up with Devin Nance. He does the talking here. So let's hear this.
Talking to some really great people. I started talking to some really great people out of Corey Bush's office and Jamal Bowman's office and Chuy Garcia's office, and so did our whole legislative department did. And their staffers are really the ones who got this going. And they like that night, they called me and said, hey, we're going to submit this. We're going to make a change. We're going to submit an amendment. And I was like, oh, cool. And a couple hours later, he calls me. He's like, did you hear the good news? Pelosi backed out. You know, they basically like pushed her to say that or to come out with the amendment to it.
Okay, first, let's just stop there. Does it sound like they were pushing for it, or does it sound like they got calls from the congressional offices saying, hey, we have a plan. Here's what we're going to do? That's what he just described there. In other words, the squad members came to these guys and said, here, we got a plan. We're going to write an amendment with paid sick leave, because they knew two things. Number one, they couldn't cross Joe Biden. And number two, they had to make it look like they were going to bat for the union workers, because otherwise they would lose all of their lefty cred. So they came up with this plan. Let's pass an amendment with all the good stuff that they want in it so that we'll look like we tried. And then the Senate will vote it down and we'll say, oh, too bad you didn't get that sick leave, but hey, we went to bat for you. That's obviously what happened. Obviously what happened. He goes on.
So she was supporting it.
But ultimately, they pushed both bills through. They did what they did with the Build Back Better last year, which is they pushed both bills through to the Senate, and the Senate voted yes on the bad bill and no on the good bill.
Correct. Yep. And that's how the House had to do it procedurally, I guess. I don't know all the details with it.
No, that's not how they, I mean, no.
They did it that way so that it wouldn't pass.
They did it so they could tell you guys they tried their best for you. That's really why they did it that way.
That really, who are these guys? These guys are pretty smart. These guys know their shit.
Yeah. Well, that you had to rush over from the Brawny paper towel ad audition, right?
That's why I had my hair short too. Yeah.
I mean, sorry.
But there was, I mean,
sorry to make
there was
worse,
some really great
yeah.
people that actually were sticking up for us and tried to help us out.
No, they weren't.
You know, it failed. It didn't work out. I'm not saying like everybody in the Democratic Party or, you know, especially in the GOP were on our side, but there were a few that were definitely on our side. And I saw it and felt it.
Well, look, sorry to tell you, Devin. And look, Devin is a working guy who has things to lose. So maybe that's him being diplomatic for the sake of being diplomatic.
Well, I think so. Like he can't say in public.
Right. He gave us that nervous laugh when we made our point. Well, no, actually, they did this so they can tell you they did their best for you. That's why they did it. That's obviously why they did it. But the point here is that what they said in that interview refutes what AOC is saying, which is that they asked us for this vote and we delivered what they wanted. No. They asked for the right to strike when Joe Biden said we need to take away their right to strike. And you guys went along with that and you came up with a bullshit plan to offer them as a consolation prize. Well, here, we're going to get you a vote on 7 days sick leave. You were not doing their bidding by passing that bill alongside the first one. And even if you thought you did, as I'm sorry, his name, Ron Kamenkow writes in Jacobin, which we just read, those bills were independent. You didn't have to pass both. They did the exact same thing that they did with BBB on this.
Exactly.
They are going to this, and they're giving the same exact bullshit excuse that they did back then, and they're expecting it to continue to work.
Please clap.